meeting we have concerning our module on tacit knowledge, probing tacit knowledge. That is the second cluster of the project TACK. So I will say a very few words about the program, since there are, together with candidates, we have invited PhD candidates from this semester from our department. So we share the presentation of that nicely and kindly. Simona Pierini, our colleague and deputy director of the department, accepted to do on a wide overview on, as she's called, urban domesticscapes, the Milanese 50s architecture. And we also invited some colleagues teaching interiors, since despite the fact that 50s architecture, Milanese architecture is worldwide renowned, very few are, let's say, working on it. And so therefore we thought it would have been an interesting opportunity. So I would say just a few words to introduce the wide audience to TACK. That is Marie Curie program devoted to, let's say, unpack what tacit knowledge is in architecture. And actually, tacit knowledge related, we might say, both to dynamics of communication within the community of practitioners. So, I mean, very much within the field of architects, but also about communicating architecture. So what happens when specific practitioners have the need or have to face the reality to communicate to other communities? Let's imagine we are thinking, of course, the clients. So there are the builders. There is the, I mean, even the larger community accepting the building. So there are conventions and codes that are used in order to, let's say, make this tacit knowledge working. The set of over the 3 years with 10 PhD candidates is willing to unpack and to make tacit knowledge untacit, let's say. That is a kind of paradox itself. Of course, there will be many other aspects that will be kept, I mean, somehow unknown, but with different approaches, taking care of different topics. Each candidate is devoting his, let's say, main dissertation on a specific element that's has been set up by the board of the professors who set up the program. This second year of the program is specifically devoted to what's so-called, as a topic, probing tacit knowledge, that try to have a closer view to what the practice is and how practices operates according to different, let's say, schemes. Claudia, as Mainardi, is part of a PhD program in Polytechnic, and also at the same time member of the TACK ESR group, is investigating the so-called codes in architecture and well, we say codes and convention and community of practices in post-war Milanese architecture. Her work is much more devoted to understanding the contemporary, let's say, epistemologies of architecture discourse, while the Milanese meeting will be mostly devoted to look backwards, and has decided to have the 50s Milanese architecture as a case study on which to focus in order to understand better, or to may unpack some of the elements, to better approach the 3 days that will be during which there will be, let's say, scheduled, it's a scheduled Milanese meeting. This is the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th of May. We prepared, together with Gaia Caramellino, that is my colleague, and actually she's the one really in charge of the program, and with Claudia Mainardi and On-Site Studio, we try to build up a sequence of meetings that should help us to come closer to the 3 days of the Milanese module. I won't say anything more, and I would leave the floor to Gaia to introduce Simona Pierini, that I really kindly thank for being available, for spending with us her knowledge on Milanese culture and architecture. Thank you, Gaia, and welcome everybody.
I would like also to thank Simona for accepting our invitation. For me, it's really a pleasure and honor to introduce her, who is a colleague and a friend. Simona Pierini is a full professor in architectural and urban composition at the Politecnico di Milano. She graduated in Milan in 1989 and then obtained a PhD in architectural composition in Venice with Giorgio Grassi at UAV in 1996. She has been working on Milan and its urban iconography since the beginning, and after several years working with Giorgio Grassi, she moved to Barcelona, to the ETSAM, where she started in the late 90s, when she started to investigate the Spanish architectural culture of the 50s, starting a collaboration with Carlos Martí Aris and Pep Keglash, who that brought to a series of very interesting exhibition and publication devoted, for instances, to the architect Josep Maria Sostres, to the houses of Coderch, and to some publications that are most recent, like the book Passaggio in Iberia, published in 2008, and the book devoted to the work of Alejandro de la Sota, titled From Matter to Abstraction, published in 2010. In 2012, she had a moment and experiences during a sabbatical year working of Bruno Reichlin at EPFL in Lausanne on the notion of architectural criticism. I would like to highlight how her research is based on an idea of architectural design that interpret the architecture of the city in the historical experiences, but as material for contemporary design. I can mention two books, the book Sulla Facciata, Tra Architettura e Città, published in 2008, and an article, Divorzio all'Italiana, devoted to the notion of place, luogo, place, yes, and history in the work of the Italian architect Ignazio Gardella. Her research investigated in particular the role, the importance of housing in the urban design of contemporary city, using also housing design as a lens to investigate the design of contemporary settlement, as emerged in her book titled Housing Primer, devoted to the form of residential architecture in the contemporary city, published in 2012. One important line, I think, in my opinion, in her research is the one devoted to the critical interpretation of the work of some masters, with the aim and the purpose is also to understanding lines of continuity with contemporary architecture. And this is the work conducted, as we mentioned before, on Spanish masters like Sostres, Coderch, de la Sota, but also on Milanese architects active during the 50s, Gardella, Rogers, and many others. And this line also emerged in her recent book, Case Milanesi, 50 Years of Residential Architecture in Milan, published in 2017, that was also shown as an exhibition at Villa Necchi in Milan. Finally, by concluding, I would like to say that Simona was also responsible for the organization of numerous exhibitions, and we can remember her participation to the Venice Biennale in 2018, and also as co-editor of the catalog Everyday Wonders, devoted to the Italian the Corso Italia complex by Cacciadominioni, and has been lecturing in several European and international, we can say, universities in the past decade. In this moment, her research is focusing on the publication of an atlas of 20th century housing history that will be the outcome of an international and a research conducted with an international team of scholars and practitioners. But she's also conducting a research on the interiors of Milanese residential houses that has been already investigated with a diverse perspective. And this is what also Simona will focus on today, for observing the interiors of the house as a laboratories, as a ground, but also as a lens to investigate and to question some forms of tacit knowledge and some forms of constructing and shaping relations in the networks between the architects and the clients, some modus operandi, and some possibilities to connect diverse communities of practice. She will focus in particular, as we said, and Gennaro said at the beginning, on the Milanese architectural culture on the 50s, on a precise community of practitioners, also known as the Professionismo Colto. And through this investigation, through this journey among interiors, she will explain why also we choose the Milanese architectural culture of the 50s as a privileged ground to investigate this idea of tacit knowledge. So thank you again, Simona, for accepting the invitation.
Okay, thank you for all the thanks you gave me. I'm quite happy. As I was saying before, it's always interesting to focus on some particular themes, on the big mountain of information we collected about Milanese architects. And so it's always, I think it's interesting. We try to understand if the focus I gave to this lecture somehow could help you during the next day. First of all, I would like to share my screen, and we check if everything is okay.
And while you do this, we have to ask everyone to close the camera.
Okay, if I do like this and I go on, you see that it's going on?
Yes, we see it.
Yes, perfect. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Since we will record the presentation, yeah, we are asked to.
Yeah, yes, I've been told. Yes, I saw.
So you will be the only one.
Okay, so I think that the aim of our exhibition, who changed the subtitle of our book was Case Milanesi, 50 Years of Residential Housing. And then when we decided to give an exhibition about these same architects, we decided to change the subtitle in Images of the City. Because I think that the Milanese architects were working on each building, but with an idea of a whole. They were building an image, a new image for the city. So I made these collages when I was preparing my essay in the book and then in the exhibition, because I mounted the facade of the different case study in an idea of streets, in an idea of part of the city. I think I use this as a cover because I think it's quite similar to the idea you're approaching, to see how each architect is a part of a whole who's working on a common ground, a common sense of an architecture that will build the new image of the city. So in these two different colleges, you see how different were the approaches of every architect. That's, I think, another important theme in these architects. We are in the modern period, not in the beginning, but in the Manierism moment of the modern architecture. And the language is very, very rich. It's very, very different. But I think we can always, through the idea, through the lens of domesticity, understand they were work for the inhabitants. And so it's interesting to see, for example, the idea of the loggia, who became a peculiar theme in these architects, passed through these works. But before we go on, I would like to show another panel I did. And this is a panel where we charged only the layer of the shadows. There is no more building, only the shadow that every building is making. And it's interesting to see each different shadow because it's a different way of the composition of the facade and the approach to the city of these architects. I would like to pass through two very quick notions I think are interesting. There is a long history in Milanese architecture to the urban landscape. It's not an idea that began in the 20th century, but we can find in the approach to the canals, in the approach of making and working how houses can build the common ground of the image of the city. And by the other side, we also can realize that also at the end of the 18th century, there was already an idea of public spaces. And the lower right image, we see the Bastioni with the Giardini Pubblici by Giuseppe Pierini. And it's a great public idea where the people was going to meet, were going to have their promenade. And it's interesting because there is an in-between the idea of collective and private from this period already. And then we have the 19th century that is working of an idea of the city that is the eclectical, the classical one, we can say, but it's structured with the schools of arts. And the image where the modern architects work that they approached is made with the code, we can say somehow. There is classical codes, there is iron balustrade, there are some typical elements that are building without not so many changes many years of the city. And then there is the new image of the city. We can approach this difference with a picture of Mario Sironi, of course, that everybody knows. In this context are the Gio Ponti, and then with Domus and Casabella, they decided to reappropriate the idea of the house as a main issue for architecture. As we all know, the idea of housing before it was nearly not into the history of architecture with the A majuscula. And it's interesting to see that in 1928, both Domus, directed by Gio Ponti, and then Casabella, the first Casabella, they began to be published. Among in the same period, also some specialist publication began. La Casa I would like to have, and then also the new materials that we can find in the pages of these magazines. Always in this first period of the modern architecture, we can see in Milanese architecture so different approaches. But on one side, I would like to show Piero Portaluppi in his own house, is closed, we can say, in his living room, although you can see the language very strong, very eclectic, and very modern in a way of this, also his aspect, no? So orgulous. And by the other side, we see in the open air, in the train, in the movement of the, through the future that was not so good for him, but a very young Terragni. So I think these two different approaches remain until the war. Two different parts, but there was a common ground, that it was architecture, it was a profession, it was the capacity of making a house, but also every detail of a house, as the chimney of Portaluppi can explain us. In this context, obviously, we have some specific essays, for example, by Albini or Ignazio Gardella in his own houses. Here we are at the end of the 30s, and I think these two works are seminal for the experiences of the 50 architecture. This is a house of Ignazio Gardella in Casa Gardella Usuelli. Here it's very interesting in these two works to see how changes the idea of the room, the idea of the space. There is a fight for lightness, we can say, and also a different approach to the idea of the living room and the relationship with the rooms. In this house, we can see corners. You can see with the carpet how the space is possessed by a place to stay near the chimney. Although the chimney is very, very small, it's without any kind of frame, it's simply whole. But in the same way, with the proportion, with the disposition, with the composition of the parts in this house, we can really understand how these architects were working on the space. And then before arriving obviously to the 50s, there was a war. There was the war, the bombing, and the destruction of a big part of Milanese core of the city. And it's interesting that in that moment, all the Milanese architects were called to make a survey on every block, on every part of the city. We have a lot of ruins, we have a lot of houses that we didn't know if we could use again, or we have to destroy, we have to change. And so I think it's very interesting to understand the approach of a whole community of architects that were called. We can see among them all the architects that then have been designed in the city in the 50s and the 60s. From De Carlo to Cacciadominione, everybody was going step by step in every courtyard to survey, to understand. And it's not only a work to understand the future, but it's always, I think, a work to understand the past. When you make a survey, you understand how a house is built, how which material has been used, the relationship between the parts. In the ruin, even more we can say, because it's something very abstract somehow. And so it's interesting to understand that the common ground of all these architects has been made walking in the city and staying into the houses, although they were destroyed. And this is a montage I made with the stamp of each office of the architects. We can see, it's interesting because we see the names, obviously, but we can always see also the streets where they lived. Sometimes they are in the same building they made, sometimes not. Very often they are in the core of the city, sometimes not. And for example, this is Ligieri that is drawing the tram. It was something that for them was something very, the idea of modernity. And then we can see also the way they make their own signature, that it's, I think, a characteral approach. But once they are mounted in a college, they become a community that worked together on the city, on the destroyed city. They worked together, for example, in the Movimento Studi Architettura, that was MSA. There was a group of architects debating of each aspect that the new city was approaching. And so I think this idea to have them all together with their own specificity, with their own character, from Luigi Moretti and his expressionist to the different, very rational, for example, BBPR, each one express a character, and each one is strictly related to the other. And in the first period before after the war, after this destruction, the architects were also living in different houses than before. For example, Cacciadominioni, who was, his palace was destroyed, and so he lived in a rooftop apartment, and he changed this idea of rooftop apartment. And there is a peculiar way to approach this new space in the city to live in, that was not part of the idea of inhabitation, of course, for the architect before. And we can find in this period some interesting operation, some interesting intervention on this kind. And then they go back to ancient city, but ancient apartments, but with an idea of, we can say, camping. They use in the first period after the war, they use big apartments, they use spaces of the ancient structure of the city, but they were using, for example, this chair is a chair, La Morettina, that were using in camping or in the outside the house. And this is this strange period where I think the space is quite, they occupy somehow their own object. We can recognize the first elements of the production of the future design of Milanese culture. And they are using, as we can see here in this sentence was written by Gio Ponti in his magazine Style, Luigi Cacciadominioni, the things as they are. So this idea of a main space and things that occupy this idea of space, not changing the space, but occupying slowly with a quiet approach, we can say. That will be changing then. And then there is, after this first period of living in rooftop and approaching only with some furniture, then there is a big reconstruction. And the big reconstruction in Milano is very important also because focus on the relationship with other very important masters, we can say, architecture and engineering. Master as Danusso, or then we can say, for example, Pierluigi Nervi. There is always a relationship, very important, very strong. This, of course, is a photo that represents the Torre Velasca in construction. This is the iron before the concrete of the Torre Velasca in construction. Because we always say that Torre Velasca is made by BBPR, but we have to say that there is also a big interesting research between architects working with the, in this case, engineer Danusso, and to approach how to have the result that the Tower of Velasca has. By the other side is the same relationship between Gio Ponti, Pierluigi Nervi. This idea of this slim, very peculiar form of Grattacielo Pirelli, and the section, the drawings of the section, this idea of the structure, always more light that we can see in the section, and also the necessity, the willingness of Pierluigi Nervi to express his strength in the last floor with an explosion, we can say, of the structure, of the idea of engineering that was suffocated by this lightness and elegance of the Grattacielo drawn by Gio Ponti. In this context, we have two big, also cultural thematic, we can say. This photo is made with a drone and shows the Torre Velasca, obviously, where we can recognize this idea of the history talking with engineering, as I was saying before. But by the other side, in the foreground, we can see also one of the most interesting buildings in the Milanese architecture of the 50s. That is Luigi Moretti complex in Corso Italia. It's interesting to confront this idea because they are working on the big scale, both of them. And the idea of urbanity and domesticity passes through the idea of a new density for the city. And I think in this photo made by Stefano Topuntoli, it's interesting to understand the two ways. By one side, a new type of housing, as we can obviously interpret the tower, and by the other side, the big slab that is a change and arrives into the, very often into the interior of the block, not in the street. The most famous building looking in Corso Italia street, it's this one, the small one. And then in the background, you find the modernity and also the density, the highness of the more dense housing block. Here we can also see all the interesting compositional themes that Luigi Moretti was editing and talking about in his magazine, Spazio. As is well known, Luigi Moretti in that period, from 50 to 53, edited 7 numbers of his own magazine. He made nearly everything in this magazine, drawing the graphical layouts, and sometimes only one, I have to say this one, the cover, but it's very interesting to read the 7 editorial he made, because I think it's like a theory of the architecture. And the idea of the cut, he was commenting Caravaggio with the idea of the architecture of the taglio. Then the idea in the same magazine, Spazio, he published this project, and he's not discussing about any kind of idea of form or formal themes, but he's discussing about the idea of flexibility in the relationship between the interior and the facade, between this part that is a plus, we can say, to the facade. I use this word as plus or flexibility because we all know they are in the mouth of everybody in contemporary architecture, in housing architecture, flexibility, or we can think Lacaton and Vassar with the plus. But these architects were there, were already essaying, they're already trying to work on these themes. And the last article he published in Spazio, quite famous, I think we all know it, it's structures and sequences of spaces. And I think that in Milanese architecture, in particular in Cacciadominioni, there is a reflection on this issue. This idea of dilatation and compression, of passages, of passing through different spaces. I think that remains a lot of this particular, although we all know that Luigi Moretti was Roman, he was not strictly part of the Milanese culture, but I think that he left something, always thinking of his building, but also in this essay, they are so strong in their, this idea of composition. I think it's very strong. By the other side, we have a very Milanese figure, strictly rooted with the Belgioioso, Banfi, and then teaching at the Politecnico, that was Ernesto Natarajas. He was directing this period. He took the direction of Casabella, and he headed the word continuity, that has many meanings, from the idea to continue the Casabella born, and more than the first Casabella, we can say the Casabella of Pagano, the 30, and then also continuity as an idea of looking of the new architecture in between the context. We were discussing before with Gaia how we can call the preesistenze ambientali, no? There is a famous article, we all know, that he's discussing, and also he's presenting his own architecture as a demonstration of this approach to an architecture that is modern, that has the density of the modern city, but it's a fragment, a part is rooted, as Chinozuki said, is grafting into the city. I have to correct Gaia. I have to say that the book with the housing complex in Corso Italia was made with Chino. I have to precise this because it was him who invited me. I want to thank him, and I don't want that his name was lost somehow. But going back to this idea of working into the city, I think that the role of Ernesto Natarajas is completely different, because Moretti is working on a formal idea. By the other side, Rogers is working in a community, an important community, in the Politecnico, in the Redazione of Casabella. Centro Studi Casabella was very strong, and was there that grew up Aldo Rossi, Guido Canella, Giorgio Grassi, all the names that then became very important. And so here we can see Rogers at the Politecnico in trouble with the student. This is Cesare Macchicassia. And this is another kind of idea of staying with the people, of talking with the people. This is Roger with young Aldo Rossi, with Zanuso, with the people of Casabella discussing in a living room. So it's a different way of understanding. Now we have to go to the conference, but then in that period there were few people always finding the occasion to stay together and to discuss if we read the essays of MSA work, it's we can understand that these architects, they were really working for a common idea, a common ground. And this is also another approach. This is Ernesto Natarroges, that is here with Feltrinelli and Paolo Grassi. So the publisher and also the communist Feltrinelli, that I think you all know, and by the other side, the theater, the idea of the theater with Paolo Grassi. So the relationship between architects and the cultural world of the city was very, very strong. And this we can find also in the pages of Casabella. These are a collage from some number of Casabella where they put together, for example, the Grattacielo Pirelli, and in this, Capogrossi, we can nearly find the plan of the Pirelli. And then Burri and the approach of the arts and also the movies. Here we can see Senso by Luchino Visconti or Monica Vitti in L'Avventura, and this is De Carlo. So the architecture is always in between the other arts. Cinema, movies, arts, l'arte povera, for example, that express a strong materiality, and then all these, I heard before the idea of the epistemology. We have to say always that Roger was very friend of Antonio Banfi and very near to Paci and to the group of the School of Milano philosopher, that it was influential, seminal for their thinking. And this idea of this community is finally, we can say, we can see how it works on the city. The idea of working with the context. This is Cacciadominioni and Asnago e Vender in two houses that were built in the 47, 49, 52, 53, just in front of one of the most important churches of the city, Sant'Ambrogio in Milano, the Romanic building. And here we can see their approach, that it's to stay in front and so to be elegant, to be somehow shy. They don't want to be so strong. But if you focus on the composition, for example, of the rhythm in the facade of Cacciadominioni, you see that it's moving somehow. There is a strong idea of this murarial part with the facade, with the holes of the window. They go back to the vertical window of the tradition. But then in the darkness of the shadow of the loggia, you see that it's a different rhythm of the window. And there is somehow an idea of to be polite for the city, we can say, but also to be very, very modern, and they don't want to lose any occasion. For example, in these two houses, it's interesting to see the entryway. That is a typical interesting theme in Milanese architecture. This is a black that shows somehow an interruption. And here we will see the detail of this small house of Asnago Venda, that they are working again with an idea of the tradition, with the marble facade, but also if we focus on the composition of the window, as Cino already expresses very well, they are working on the symmetrical and asymmetrical composition of the facade. This is a detail of the facade of Caccia, where we can see the different idea of movement that is somehow held by these two parts. You see that it's no more an idea of palace that makes the corner to the city, but it's an idea completely, we can say, are surfaces. It's not a block, a urban block, but there are different surfaces mounted to realize the idea of the building. These are some details, and this is Entryway. And in this same building, we have the office of Cacciadominioni. He arrived there in 1947, and he stayed there until his death. It was a few years ago. And this is a photo that shows his desktop, where we can see a very peculiar, important things for Milanese architecture. There are colors, materials, stones. There are drawings, but also piece of art. It's in the part, in the sotterraneo, come si dice? Vabbè, come si dice sotterraneo? Oh,
underground.
Underground, sì, ecco, non mi veniva underground. In the underground of the same house, but it's very lighted. It's incredible because you go down with a typical Cacciadominioni staircase and you arrive at this light. In this light where he was sitting there drawing the houses. And this is the detail I was talking before about Asnagavender, and also the relationship with the different rhythm, with the different composition. Is not on the axis, on the symmetric axis, but is a part. And then the most famous building in the center of the city, one that expressed very strongly the relationship with the context, that is the building made by Asnagavender in Via Lanzione, that continues, by one side, the idea and the height of the Palazzo Visconti, but then in the rear part gives to the garden an open, a big building where the density again changes, and where the windows talk about modern architecture. And it's interesting to see the difference between this idea of continuity and this idea of a completely different approach. When we see this building from the street, we see two blocks. And when we can go on the roof, on the building in front, we understand that these architects were working, molding this architecture. And I think this photo is interesting because express somehow this approach of all these architects. They are not trying to impose something. They try to put it working in a plastic way, molding the buildings, not putting one against the other one. And I think this idea is very important to understand Milanese architecture, because it's very strong if you see it superficially, but if you go inside and you understand their approach, you can really understand that, for example, there is a small movement to look at the sun. There is an idea that the rear facade is becoming a facade, going up with the architecture. And so it doesn't have to be anymore an ugly facade with a kitchen, the bathroom, but has to be a composition again. And so it's interesting that they are working, for example, in between the idea of the wall and the idea of the trilytic. The idea of make more dense some parts, Moretti would say, and to make light some other, and then to put the focus on someone. So also the rear facade of this building, I think is very important to understand that they control every part of the building, because every part of the building was part of the city. And in this way, I think that this corner expressed very, very well this idea, because there is no weight of the stone. There is no weight of the, it's like simply a surface. And in these two surfaces that meet together, you find the two different ideas. By one side, the marble and the vertical window of the city, and by the other side, the clinker and the Le Corbusierian window, narrow window of the facade into the garden. And here, in this same building, we can approach this interesting theme that was already been published by TACK, that is the idea of the entryway of Milano. We can pass through 2 or 3 examples, but I think we still have to talk about it, because it's the point where you go into the house. It's the point where the city goes into the house, the place in between the urban and the domesticity. And sometimes it's the domesticity that goes out, that goes into the entryway, and sometimes it's, for example, the stone or the hardness of the materials that comes into the entryways. This is always in Via Lanzone. This is another entryway of the 30 by Asnagavenda. But for example, the tip was approached by Giovanni Muzio in the 30, and also the movies, also a director of movie as Antonioni understood that it was a point of interest in Milanese architecture. We have to say that Michelangelo Antonioni, the director, was very, very interested in Milanese architecture. Again, once more, we can say that this expressed this strong relationship between all the kinds of artists. No? It was people of cinema, it was people of architects, philosophy. And in this image, we can see the Casa in Via Lanzone with Marcello Mastroianni coming out from the car. This is the house we saw. And this, for example, is again a movie by Michelangelo Antonioni, Cronaca di un amore, where Lucia Bosè comes out from Palazzo Fidia from Andreani. And there are some other pictures of the movies where we can recognize, for example, Luigi Moretti, the housing complex we saw before. Because this idea of the entryway is very, somehow a way to bring the city into the building. I'm talking from here, exactly, I'm here in the underground of this porch. And I always pleased to hear the people talking, the babies playing in this space, because it's interesting because it's very live place. It's like a street in the ancient villages. And I think that Milanese architects were so good to understand how to go into the house, leaving the modern city, the street, the traffic, and to give a pause and then going into the houses. And going into the houses, we go first of all to see the houses of Ignazio Gardella, the elegant and snobbish Ignazio Gardella. Here in a shoot by Irving Penn. Irving Penn in 49 asked Ernesto Ratarrogen to write an article for Vogue, and he photographed all the architects, Milanese architects. And I think this photo of Ignazio Gardella is unbelievable because it's very he expressed his way, and also a different way in staying from the other architects. On the other part of the image, we see his own house that we will see in a few minutes. Gardella was working, this is not Milano, but we have to say that is one of the most interesting relationship between the floor plan and an elevation, I think, because by one side we have 2 blocks here, and then when we see here, we see 3 tall buildings, because he used the idea of the entryway to broke the whole building, and also the roof is following this idea. And so he passed from a banal, we can say, or normal floor plan typology, a staircase with 2 apartments, to a completely different idea of volumes and elevation. And I think this, I love this example because it expresses the control they had between the plans and the way they were composing the facade. And I was saying before, one of the elements of this composition is the idea of the loggia, how the whole interior of the house, the apartment, were going up to the city, where yes, I think in this drawings, you can see in the gray, in the light gray, the living rooms, and then in the dark gray, the exterior part, the terraces or the balcony of these buildings. This is Gardella, this is Gio Ponti, this is Morasutti, this is Umberto Rifo. In a different way, sometimes they became the whole facade, the main facade. For example, in this case, or in this one, it's more an interesting work on the floor plan because of the place where it's located. And going even more into that house, these houses, we see this idea of the light, this idea of the work of the interior in relationship with the window, always from the floor to the ceiling. And then we can see also a lamp, a symbolic lamp that tell us about the work of the Azucena. Azucena was a society that was created by Caccia, Gardella e Corradi dell'Acqua, that they decided, I remember a discussion of Caccia Dominione that he said, we cannot draw objects for every client. We have to do something that we love, that when the client put his own lamps, we hate him. And we want to make all the furniture that could be the right ones for our houses. And so in 47 or 48, they decided to make a society for the production of this object. And it's interesting because, again, it's not only the architects, but it's a relation with the industrial for the north of Milano, where all the industrial and artisan were. And it's strictly related also to this opportunity of working together. Another theme we always find in the pages, in the first pages of the magazine, is the modern form, the idea of folding the walls of the world. And then we can see the Pirelli with the idea of the gomma piuma, and so how also changed the idea of the furniture and the sofa. The first house, it's a very big house, so it's not, it's very exceptional, we can say, because the whole floor plan is occupied by one apartment that is cut by the staircase and shows by one side this idea of moving in and out the living part of the apartment, the living rooms, the dining room, the chimney and the studio, and approaching and using in different ways as a balcony or a terraces, the space outside. By the other side, a very clear, simple disposition of the kitchen and the rooms. Again, shifting these two parts is understanding that this part, a strong part, became soft to be molded to open again another loggia to the park. These are the drawings, and this is the building, and these are the interiors. As we can say, also is very strong this idea of the gallery that we will see again in other Gardella houses, for example, his own houses in Via Marchionne. And the entrances become here enlightened by this idea of, we think there is always a point of view that comes also, I think here we can see the Tugendhat, no, of Miss van der Rohe. There is always this idea of peculiar Milanese architecture, but we all know they also were very well informed, and they knew the modern architecture that was around the world, in Europe in particular. It was very strong, the relationship with the other architects. And then going into the living room, we can see this idea of the walls moving as furniture. The doors, again, you see the continuity of the floor and the ceiling, and this idea of flexibility of spaces through free elements that can move. In particular, this strange door that opened to the studio where the chimney is. The idea of moving the walls was also an experience made in a house that changed 3 times in the house Vignardi, I think, by Angelo Mangiarotti with Klein, not Yves Klein, another American artist, because again, it was very strong, the relationship with the artist. This happens very often, for example, in Cacciadominioni with Francesco Somaini. And here it's an idea of moving the spaces, but also adding this painting on the walls. This is the house by Gardella in Via Marchionne. In this photo, we can see very clearly that the strength of the clinker free rear part of the house, it's disappear to leave space to the domesticity that comes out with this rose adobe and these windows that are moving on a railway, we can say, on this idea of moving the interior spaces. We can say ville, we can say different approach. I would like to focus on the different way that this house was built by Ignazio Gardella with Roberto Menghi and Anna Castelli Ferrieri. And they all lived here, and each one has been designing his own house. And they have different approaches. The house is made very simply by a strong part with a staircase, bathroom and kitchen, and then a free part where there is a wall between the 2 apartments. And then it was very, very free the way they approach this open to the garden. The very famous history of the tree, but in particular, we can see the different way to approach this theme of the gallery. This is Menghi house that it was broken and cancelling this idea of the gallery. This is the house of Anna Castelli, very, very abstract somehow, with the ancient house from Cavalieri or the Tonnet. And by the other side, the Ignazio Gardella own house that was in the upper part, in the rooftop. Here you can see in the plan, it's very, very strong, this idea of the gallery that open to different spaces that are in relation in between the other. We can remember this idea of sequences that Luigi Moretti brought in the pages of Spazio. And here we can recognize very well, because also the elements, a small door or a big door that becomes a wall. This idea of the scale that changes in the same rooms and then can give us some, express us this idea of changes and passing through, and give it the idea of dilatation or openness or more closed parts. This is some photos of the houses. These are great photo made by Giorgio Casali. And this was the woman of Ignazio Gardella, Pao, a Chinese woman. He left his wife for this very beautiful woman. And always in the photo of Casali, it's interesting because here we can see the serious woman, but also the mirror of the house. And is looking at us, but also we can understand the importance of the house. This is the actual situation of this house that is held by the nephew, Edoarda, and we can recognize the same elements I was discussing before, this great fence that becomes doors, but also walls of this apartment. They change the space with these elements. And this is, by the other side, we look to the gallery. Every part of these buildings, of these Milanese architectures, are very, very controlled by the point of view of the detail. This idea of moving onto these railways is also headed to this idea of changing this measure, the 40 measure of the blocks of the concrete is molded by this canal. And so it changes with a small shadow. Again, if you read Moretti, he talks about moldings. And here Gardella is making molding to approach the elegance. And here is Gardella in this same house. The first time I was there, he has his own office there, and there was a little room where he kept all the materials. And I love this photo because I think that the touch of the materials is very, very strong, is very, very important in this architects always. And when you can see their catalog, their shelves full of stones, but also every pieces of wood and lamps and everything, I think it's very important to understand how they approach the profession and how changed later, because the intellectual way of approaching architecture of the 70s and the 80s is completely different. They lost the relationship with the materials, the relationship with the colors, with the idea of living, we can say somehow. It's very strong, we can debate about it. But I think it's very important to see how the color, the materials, the designing of each part of the houses. This is Giulio Menoletti houses in the rooftop of the other building in the Giardino d'Arcadia. We can always discuss about the relationship to the parts, the modern folding, and how this idea of the loggia is not only in that part of the city, but is a theme that across also the work of Mangiarotti Morasutti. In Via Quadronno, they use this idea of the window that becomes, it's not a window, but a whole facade made by windows and loggia, and this changed the idea of the city again. Is published on Casabella not as one building, but as an idea of continuity of the facade of Prospetti. And so again, we confirm this idea that those architects, they are not working for their own one building and their masterpiece, but in the idea of a continuity, as they say by their own words. And this idea of continuity is also into the interior of this house. We have a very strong, clear, functionalist, typological living into the rooms and the parts for the night. And by the other side, a very free use of the living room and the balcony that very soon were all occupied and closed. And in this, again, in this building has his own office, the same Bruno Morasutti, a very strange office, this round room where the light came only from one side, this, and he was there until he's dead again. The detail. I was discussing about the theme of the detail in the facade of Marchiondi, but again, we can talk about this iron detail that make this shadow on the frame of the Via Quadronno windows. Again, the theme of the loggia, the relationship between the idea of flexibility, here is Gio Ponti in Via Dezza, is working with the loggia, but also with an inhabitated window, we say. And so we have three different spaces working together, the terraces, the window, and then passing to each one to another one, to this passing through the rooms. Again, another theme is the idea of how this facade becomes at night. And here a collage with this idea of leaving the facade, and this is show how we go through the house from room to room, from the more public room to the collective of the dining room, and then at the end to the more private rooms of the girls. Here in the same building, again in the garage, in the lower part of the building, the office, but also where domus were produced. And here is Gio Ponti, again, with the idea of drawing. Everyone can remember the drawings of Gio Ponti, the letter he made, this, his ability of using the pencil or using the pen. Here is making maybe some porcelain or some ceramic, we don't know. But it's interesting to see their own office that is quite big, we can say. It's an industrial, but by the other side, he's he's staying on the drawings, something that is left in the practice of today. No, it's not so easy to see the people at their desktop. And then the last architects I would like to talk to you, and then I close. I hope I didn't, was not too long. It's Cacciadominioni. In the upper part here, we can see a floor plan by Aldo Andreani in Palazzo Fidia, because I think it was somehow an ancestry that Cacciadominioni floor plan works on. And here we see some of the buildings he made, where the idea of living is very, very, very interesting. I think one of my favorites is for sure this housing block of the 56, 58 in Vianievo, because express the idea of the block against this idea of putting together one on the other the same apartment. We have been seeing how also Gardella was moving the facade with the idea of the villas, but in Cacciadominioni is more clear, I think, because it's very strong, these images. The verticality of the normal city is completely lost. He works on this idea of a rhythm of horizontality. It's interesting because from the interior, it's not so dark, we can say this with building. We have loggia, we have bow window, we have many kind of window, bigger one, small one, but they are a composition that express what? Express the idea that every client, every inhabitant could have his own apartment, different from the other one. There are 9 floors, and each floor has 4 apartments, and we have 36 different apartments. Because in this period, in this moment where the Borghese houses were built, you can ask the architect to change the house. And so it's a very simple, normal way of putting together 2 blocks. So a staircase that distributes 2 flats. Here and sometimes not so here, the division, but then you can see all the different way. For example, the position of the living room that is changing has a different approach of the idea of living in the corner or in the center part, with the bow window, with the loggia, different way that are very often chosen by the client. And again, it's interesting to see the relationship of these architects with the clients. I found in a drawings by Caccia in Via Massena, is late building I didn't put today, that we were focusing more on the 50s, but it was written, this was changed by the Signora Lazzati, that he wanted to know that it was the Signora Lazzati who changed this. And this is a drawings by him that express this idea of moving, this idea of different forms of the spaces and the relationship between them, the different compression and dilatation we were discussing before. One of the most interesting from this point of view buildings is the complex we have made. We made with Cino Zucchi the survey to make the pavilion in Biennale. And I think the thing that most intrigued me is that he's working on the Corso Italia. He makes a picture facade. Aldo Rossi called it the portofinismo, because it was against this idea of village. But I think that Cacciadomenioni, by his own, is knowing very well that this is a rare facade, because we have elevators, we have kitchens, bathroom, and what he was interested in, it was in the courtyard. And so he makes a public gallery that passes through the building from the street and go to what is, for him, the real facade. This is the facade on the Corso Italia. I think it's something like a fake, we can say. And by the other side, the core of the building is the interior space. With Cino Zucchi, we made for the Biennale these 5 models, 5,550 and 5. And we made 250. One was this, that was exactly the idea of Moretti. In Spazio, you saw the models he made to express the space. And we made the same for this gallery and the entrances. You see very well how strange is the system of distribution that brings to the houses. And this is a photo of the same distribution, where we can see the materiality, the same of the exterior, but also the floors that are made by Francesco Somaini, the painter, the sculptor, his friend that he was working with. And this is the courtyard, where really the idea of inhabitation and the idea of the loggia, of the light, of the living rooms is strongly expressed by the different way to go out. I think it's very interesting also, the original drawing. I always, it's too long today to express it, but I want to let you see that it's oriented on this part. And this is Corso Italia, no? A strange communication, because one should think that the Corso is the main part. And no, the paper is oriented here. And this is the ancient Roman road of the city of Milano. And in the same, as you can see here, there is also a tall building, a black tall building, this one, where lived, and this is the house of Francesco Somaini that lived in the tower. And he had a very simple house. It's interesting that he says 24 meters square of closet. He's talking to the client, he's talking to the wife of the client that want to be free to have spaces for his dresses. And also here we can see a peculiar thing, these 3 doors that distributes, it's interesting because it's working with the public space of the living room. Sometimes I use the words of the city into the house. This is a way how Cacciadomenioni used to say that he was a Baroque urbanist. And sometimes I use the same words, I realize. And there are what you call small plazas, as this one, that rely to all the rooms, for example. And this is the door. This is another interesting history. I'm going to finish in a few minutes. This is the house he made for a builder, the Mondelli family. In the history, the urbanistic history, that we are in the city garden, and so he had to make a small house with this height, but they wanted more. And so this strange form, so plastic, became from the norms, from the rule of the city. that has the end of the building here, and this had to be the roof. And this is interesting also because from this family of the builders that lived there until a few months ago, we have the opportunity to see the structure, the beams and the pillars, and to understand how it works. I love these drawings because it's like Adolf Ross, Casa Roofer, where you see the interior space, the problem of the structure, and what you want to do with the drawings of the facade, with the composition of the facade. Some are windows, some are simply mirroring parts of opaline, and sometimes are parts of aluminium. And so we have all these different elements, but very well controlled. And again, in a very interesting floor plan, the public space of the living room with changes of roof, for example, ceilings, and all the themes of the different spaces and the concatenation of these different spaces, one by the other. And then the last house of Cacciadominioni, I want to close with. It's a part of the city very interesting. We go back here to the center. This is San Sempliciano. This is Cavalieri del Santo Sepolcro. Here we have BBPR with their own office. They also this and this building remade after the war. This is Luigi Moretti, an interesting architect who made in Corso Sempione the Piaggio building. And in this context, Cacciadominioni made for, again, the relationship with the industrial city of Milano, the Pirelli houses. In particular, he made the two the last floor plans, and it's very interesting to see the works on different plans and scales of this apartment. There is a big atrium, and there is a living room, and then there is a gallery that is here in the sketches and in the photo always by Casali, where we have the idea of the horizontality of this path, but also this, we can say, spaces to stay into the garden, very strictly related to this idea of the gallery. And I would like to close with this image of, again, of Casali, that I think it's interesting because express also somehow an idea of horizontality that Cacciadominioni is always looking with this grafting of breadth of the spaces of the living room where the people could sit and stay. I am closing with this, and I think we have been passing through architects with the paint and sculpture, with the movies, in between them, builders, the industrial people of the city. I think there is matters of work for the students for approach this city. I think anyway, if I can help you anymore, here I am.
Thank you. Thank you, Simona, for this extraordinary journey in the Milanese interiors. I think that well, the pictures are also fantastic, and it's, you have
yes, because my English is not so
extraordinary. No. But extraordinary material that really, I think, provide multiple lines for our
these buildings together with Simona. I think I also recognized a few pictures we took that day in the house of Gardella in the Giardino d'Arcadia. But thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. I would only have perhaps a small, let's say, comment. I appreciated very much the collage of facades that you presented at the beginning, which are in a way also close to my research at the moment within the TACK network, which is dealing also with this idea of collage. And I think they show very well, in a way, also a very specific aspect of Milanese architecture, which is related to this kind of fragmentation, very specifically, let's say, individuated with fragments very clearly defined, but anyway, perhaps I would say very different from the kind of fragmentation that is produced by contemporary architecture many times. A sort of coherent fragmentation. Yeah. It was just a comment, and yes, thank you very much.
And you want to discuss your thesis, if you want, here I am.
Certo, for sure, it would be very interesting to do that.
Yes, it's interesting, the relationship and to see the actual context and that context, how different they are. This idea of fragmentation is interesting, that focus.
Well, maybe I could also ask a question or make a comment, and thank you, Simona, for this very exciting presentation. I mean, I really haven't formulated this as a question because I kept so many notes. I mean, many things you said sparkled my interest. Particularly, I found very interesting your mentioning of how these architects worked together after the war. And you suggested that actually their serving the ruins of the city seems to appear like a common ground and to have, you know, a formative influence for them. I mean, I found this very interesting, and maybe it links somehow also to the idea of, you know, how typologies and urban typologies of the past are found in the work afterwards. I understand this is one thing you mean by that, but also in terms of materiality, perhaps. Yeah. I mean, serving ruins and being inside demolished buildings also gives a very strong sense of material. So this is one thing I felt like, if you
are interested, they published a book that is called, the author is in our school is Gianfranco Pertot, and the book is called 46, sorry, Milano. But if you look on the web of the municipality, you find all the sheets of this survey. They are published online. You can find it. And it's interesting because I show a part of the city, but you can see each one. For example, I did that work for Corso Italia building. I understood what was destroyed and not, and what need to be changed, or and so on. So it's very, very interesting if you work on Milano to pass through that. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe another comment as well, because I think this is all part of, indeed, of, you know, a collage of how these communities are formed. I found very interesting what you mentioned about a collaboration between architects and industrialists, or, you know, industrial artisans. And I didn't have any idea this happened in Milan or in Italy at that point.
Milano,
but it's
yes, it's an industrial city, Milano, from the end of the 19th century. And I use the image of Sironi to tell about this strong change from a very quiet city to a very modern industrial, with the railways, with the outskirts of the city. And all these architects are working a lot. For example, when we say Grattacielo Pirelli, obviously Pirelli was a big industries that was near the station, but it's not important actually. But also Bicocca of Gregotti, it's a very long history. And so, for example, Pirelli, but also Falk, but also, yes, for example, the house Belgioioso made in Via Manin was for the Falk, that was an iron industry. We have a lot of relationship with the industrial.
What I wanted to ask is if anyone could compare this to the Deutsche Werkbund, the pre-war movement on, between architects, industrialists, etc. This was, something that came to my mind.
This way, industrial. But I think we can. It's different because there was in the 25, 27. I think here the Milanese and Italian design is born with Azucena. Anna Castelli Ferrieri, for example, was the cartel, the industry cartel with the K. And some of them became working together. I think here that we have interior professor that could be more precise on this case. But we can say that in this period are beginning another kind of idea of industry. I was talking about iron or, for example, Pirelli, they are the pneumatici, pneus, and so. And by the other side, yes, they began to drawing object and then they build the industry of the design. Yes, it's right.
Maybe I just to make it, let's say, more a shared conversation. I would imagine that what you, Jonas, was highlighting, this presence of craftsmanship and an industrial dimension was very present in some of the buildings that Simona presented. For instance, this Morassutti in Via Quadronno. So there is a strong presence of the industry culture in prefabricated modules. So it's when, let's say, there are those architects that were using the knowledge, the technical knowledge, in order to imagine a new possible, let's say, future for architecture. Maybe even taking really for granted the idea of Corbu, of the machine habitaire, so that you could really implement the industrial process into the architectural process. Where, so it's interesting where this craftsmanship can go down to these objects that Simona was mentioning, but also goes even to the building dimension. And then you have I find, I know, a sort of kind of connections or fleshing idea. What's happening? This is or Simona's dog is getting crazy. He's tired of us. Yeah, but let's think about this detailing. No, when Simona was showing the windows, but of course you can see this detailing at different scale. Goes to the object, goes to the elements of, let's say, finishing architecture, like a window, a door, but can be the elements in itself. I mean, the prefab as a extremely crafted detail. See the dog. What? You have two dogs, but I thought you had this Labrador. No. Now there's newcomers.
No, questi non sono I miei, sono ospiti.
Okay.
I have to leave you in a few minutes.
So if there is a last question, if not, we thank Simona.
Okay.
I don't know.
Eventually, we can stay a little bit more if you want to share with us any other comments. We leave Limona, Simona.
Limona, Piemonte.
Limona.
Okay.
Simona.
Grazie Simona, davvero generosissima. Amazing documentation. Okay, the lecture was recorded, but I took a lot of pictures, screenshot of images that I was
okay. If you need help during your workshop here, just ask.
It's great. You will be.
Okay. Thank you.
Suggest. Grazie.
Ciao, ciao a tutti. Bye.
Ciao, grazie
Ciao,
Simona.
grazie, grazie.
Ciao. Ciao.